You're listening to the Tel Aviv Review here on TLV1. I am Gilad Halpern. Welcome back. I'm now joined here in the studio by Dr. Amira Halperin. She's a communications scholar who has recently completed her PhD thesis at the University of Westminster in the United Kingdom. It focuses on the use of new media by the UK's Palestinian diaspora. Hello, Amira. Welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you.
So before we start, there's a question about your methodology that I have to ask. It's one heck of an audacious endeavor for an Israeli researcher to embed herself in the Palestinian diaspora in the UK.
Yeah, indeed. I think the main problem is, two main problems actually. One is how the Palestinians themselves perceived an Israeli academic who wants actually to come and research their community. And the second problem is how the Israeli community, and especially the Israeli academic community, how it has been perceived by this community as an objective research. Because the problem is that once you come and actually meet with the Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, and I met with like 200 Palestinians for the thesis and more Palestinians for off-the-record conversations. And you meet Palestinians that are identified with the Hamas party, with the Fatah party. So immediately it's a problem because they are saying, why an Israeli researcher wants to come into our community? And
even more so, the fact that they actually agreed to meet with you is remarkable in and of itself.
Yeah, thank you. It's very difficult to get an access, and as a scholarly the scholars say about this, most of the researchers, the Israeli researchers, will not conduct such a research because of the difficulties, because there the hostility between the two communities. Of course, there is the boycott on Israel, and it's very difficult.
Yeah, the anti-normalization.
Yeah, it's very difficult to go and to research this community, and therefore no research has been done before. This is the first
How did you get
research.
access to so many Palestinians? Some of them are, have very strong prejudices against Israelis. Were there more Palestinians that didn't want to meet with you than there were Palestinians who did?
In the beginning, it wasn't easy. In the beginning, when I said to myself, I have to arrange the individual interviews and I have to start the meetings with the Palestinians, it was very difficult to get an access and to meet with them. And once I started and I met the first Palestinian, he was from Exeter in the UK, and he's very much identified with Hamas. He's very, a liberal and like academic, but he's. It wasn't easy.
Like
it
a contradiction.
Easy. He was liberal.
And at the same time?
He was liberal in terms of, you ask how he agreed to meet with me. He was liberal in terms of, okay, I will meet with you. But once we had the meeting, it was very difficult because even he introduced me to other people and they were reluctant to speak in the beginning, and they were very, very unhappy about my aims, my goals, what I really want to do.
Did you ever feel in physical danger?
Once when I went to conferences and to mosques, I had one event which was very unpleasant. I went to Regent Park Mosque, which is the biggest mosque in London, actually, and it was one of day after one of the IDF operations, and the atmosphere there was very, very bad, and the Palestinians and the Muslim community there was very, very upset with what IDF did, and they were looking online on the news, and I was coming to do my interviews, and I came to interview the people, and they were very upset, and they're trying to say, you're not belong here, just go away. And I stayed the whole day. I didn't give up. There were demonstrations on the same day in front of the embassy, and it was this was one event that I remember that was very difficult.
But you never hid the fact that you're Israeli. It was, up front. You said, I'm an Israeli researcher and I'd like to speak to you. You never, it was always on the table.
It was always on the table, and if we had political discussions, it was political discussions for personal purposes. I mean, it wasn't something that was brought into the research because I know that the research, I knew the rules. The rules are very tough to get a PhD, so you have to be very objective. So everything that I heard from them was that they were talking to me about politics per se, not about what I was asking.
Yeah.
This was left.
So this is even more of an impediment when it comes to scholarly research, isn't it? Tell us a bit about the obstacles that you had as an Israeli researcher beyond the fact that you had to work hard to get access to these people and to get them to talk to you. But also, what is your added value as an Israeli researcher? You said, as we said in the beginning, you're the first Israeli to engage in this kind of research.
I think that the main value of an Israeli researcher, and I hope that other Israeli researchers would follow suit and they will also conduct research of this kind. But there is a major advantage. When I talked with Palestinians, academic Palestinians, and they told me that their obstacle as Palestinians is their involvement, their personal involvement, because once a Palestinian researcher wants to interview people from Gaza and from the West Bank, he knows the people. So it's very difficult for him because he has to be, he's involved in the historical perspective, the personal story.
But you're also involved in a way in the conflict, in the political context. Yeah. I mean, can you really detach yourself from it? Perhaps there's no answer to this question.
No, I think it's very important to say that yes, I can, because if people will not perceive this fact as it would be very difficult to look at this research as an objective research. But I think the problem of the Palestinians, in contrast to the problem of me as an Israeli researcher, is that they actually part of the community. They are not outsider researchers. So if someone from Gaza and the West Bank want to interview his fellow friends and he asks a specific question and he has to be very cautious about the internal politics inside, I detach from the community. I'm not part of the community, so in this respect, it's a little bit easier. But of course, it's very difficult in the sense that can I detach myself from the conflict, from the fact that we are two parts to the conflict, and I'm trying to produce an objective research. But yes, I'm saying yes, I have managed to do it because I have learned to listen. I've just listened to even to the tough things that I've been told, and I've been sometimes when I was sitting with a Palestinian in front of me and we were talking, they were accusing me and my government.
But wasn't it counterproductive to your research, the fact that it always turned out to be somehow connected, like a political discussion other than questions and answers about your research topic and things that you want to find out?
No, I think no, because before I started my PhD, I worked as an Israeli correspondent, and I worked with the Arab community as a correspondent, not as academic, but I learned how to behave.
Do you speak Arabic?
Yeah, I learned 7 years in the UK. So I learned how to behave within this community.
You learned Arabic in the UK?
Yeah. I learned
That's amazing.
When I did my master's and my PhD, I also learned Arabic for 7 years.
You came from Israel without knowing a word of Arabic? And
I knew from high school.
No, but that's...
I learned a professional Arabic. So I believe that...
Did you conduct your interviews in Arabic or in English?
No, this was very interesting because we were sitting there speaking in English in the UK, so it was a little bit easier because we did the small talks in Hebrew and in Arabic, and when I met Palestinians that didn't know English, we did speak in Arabic. Right. I did interview in Arabic, but interviewing in English has the advantage for both of us because of the hostility between the two communities.
Sure, it's a neutral language.
So using a neutral language, it's much better.
Yeah. And another perhaps methodological question now that, is not entirely connected to your Israeli nationality is the fact that you studied trends of media use by the Palestinian community. Now, the Palestinian community is kind of an amorphous term as far as I understand it, for several reasons. One is that Palestine is still not a country, so therefore it has no, there's no legal category for a Palestinian expat in the UK. It's more of a perhaps cultural, historical, ethnic definition, but also the fact that they're still part of the Arab world. And when it comes to the media, I mean, the division between nationalities in media use is kind of obscure because, I mean, you have pan-Arabic media organizations, namely Al Jazeera, but also others. So tell us a bit about those problems and how you circumvented them.
The problem of the Palestinians media market is that they are not, as you mentioned, they are not a state. They don't have a state. They are not a nation with a state. And they are in the scholarly, they've been defined as a stateless diaspora. And it's very different from other Arab countries because they don't have a liberal media market and not a developed media market, and it's very political. The political websites, for example, as the Palestinians say, it's very political. I mean, it's basically they describe their news as propaganda news websites. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult. But from the other end, they belong to the Arab community as well. Mm-hmm. So what they do is, while sitting in the diaspora, is using mostly, this was one of the interesting findings of the research, is using mostly the Israeli media. Because they find the Israeli media and mostly Haaretz newspaper, because they prefer Haaretz newspaper. And they say that Haaretz newspaper has really the news that they want to read. And they say it's very liberal, and they prefer to read Haaretz and not Al Jazeera necessarily or other Arab...
They prefer Haaretz to Al Jazeera?
Yeah, because when something happened in Israel and in Palestine, as they define it, they say that all the time things happen there. So they need to read news all the time. Mm-hmm. And if they want to read about a certain place in Gaza, what happened to their family, or certain place in the West Bank. So they will go to Haaretz, and the Israeli journalists that work in Haaretz are also being invited to their conferences in the UK. Mm-hmm. Of course, they will read also Al Jazeera, but they prefer to read the Israeli
because
media.
It's a more local voice.
Yeah.
Even though it's the voice of the enemy.
Even though it's the voice of an enemy, it's very interesting because while I was in the UK, I lived in the UK for a few years, so obviously I will not read the Arab media. I would read Israeli media. Yeah. The Israelis that live in the diaspora, they would read their own media. So it's very interesting that from the one hand, we are the two sides of a conflict, and
you're being fed by the same media outlet.
Yeah.
So this brings me to a more philosophical question, if you like. Given that, to what extent do you think, as a communications scholar, that our media consumption really shapes our worldview? Because here, in this case, you see two sides of the conflict that are, as I said, fed by the same media outlet, yet their worldview is almost antithetical to each other.
Yeah, it's one of the important things to remember is that they use the Israeli media because they want to read news. They want to read news because news and politics is the most important thing for them. They are involved in news and politics regardless their age, their occupation, their length of stay in the diaspora. It doesn't matter. News and politics are part of their daily life, and it's very important for them. So what they do, they read Israeli media, but from the other end, they produce media for themselves. What they do, they use like hundreds of chats and blogs and social media networks in order to disseminate their own news stories. Mm-hmm. So they are taking part also in, of course, following the new technology revolution, so they can now use the internet. So they are not like passive audience that just read the media and Israeli media, but they also produce their own narratives in their own words, by using the...
Is that what you mean in the title of your essay, the use of new media? So that is more this more, say, productive and interactive news production?
Yeah, because we see in recent years when we talk about diaspora in general, not only in the Palestinian context, but in the Palestinian context, it's very evident. When we talk about the diaspora in general, we see that they are very much involved in conflict and conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. So we see in the case of the Palestinians that they use the new media for political purposes. They are trying to reach international audiences, Western audiences, not only Arab audiences, and they are trying to use their own narrative, historical stories and their personal stories in order to get people understand what their story.
To what extent also this is really instrumental in the processes of community building among the Palestinians? Does this serve as perhaps a basis for any kind of social activity beyond just the dissemination of information?
Yeah, of course, because they have many meetings and conferences where they meet not only their own people in the UK, but they meet the British people, they invite the British people, and they are helping in terms of donations and demonstrations, and they are really working hard for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And the reason is, as they explain it, that they have a very strong solidarity with the people in Gaza and the West Bank. One of the Palestinian women, for example, that live in Nablus, she told me that I live in London, but I sleep in Nablus. It's the connection, the solidarity with the people there, it's the land, and the feelings of if something happens, we have to know about it, we have to help them. So it's a very unique community in this term. It's very political community. Mm-hmm. The Palestinian community, it's very,
Obviously.
I mean,
Yeah. And how do the political differences within the community, say Fatah loyalists as opposed to Hamas loyalists, but also others, come into play?
When I went to Hamas conferences and I went to Fatah conferences, and I met with these groups and these groups, but I can say that in terms of the conflict and in terms of the media consumption, of course, the way how to operate is a little bit different, but the attitude is not very much different. I mean, the attitude and the feelings and how they use the language is not so different. Mm-hmm. How they use the language in terms of media. For example, we see their news websites. So Hamas is really, it's very clear when you look, for example, when you look at Hamas websites, that the language that is being used in their website is very emotional. And it doesn't fit to the normal media language. Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't oblige to do what the mainstream media do in terms of language. Mm-hmm. So they can use a very provocative language, for example. In Fatah websites, it's a little bit more moderate, but also the gap is not so big.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Amira Halperin, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. But thank you so much for coming in today. You're a communications scholar and the first Israeli researcher to carry out a study of the use of new media by the UK's Palestinian diaspora, and it's really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much.